You blink awake to the sound of church bells. It's not your alarm. It's the real thing iron, swinging in a stone tower echoing across a thatched village. You sit up, but your mattress isn't a mattress. It's a sack of straw that smells faintly like goat urine and mold. The blanket wrapped around you weighs like wet wool, and it kind of is, because last night it rained and your roof leaked again. Your feet touch the dirt floor. Not cold tiles, not hardwood, dirt. Packed, uneven, and crawling with something you're trying not to think about. There's no toothbrush, no phone, no light switch. The only thing glowing is the fire barely still smoking in the hearth where your family cooked a pottage last night. It's still in the pot, probably still warm. You might eat that for breakfast. You push open the door. The air is wet. The smell is sharp smoke, manure, and the distinct tang of humanity. A man is leading a pig by a rope. A child pees into a ditch. A barefoot woman is elbow deep in laundry she's beating against a rock. Everyone's already been awake for hours. You've just woken up in a medieval village. And everything you think you know about this time, about castles and knights and fairy tales, is wrong. Because the truth? The real Middle Ages wasn't a single story. It was thousands of lives stitched together by mud, bread, blood, prayer, superstition, and the constant struggle just to get through another day. So what did they eat? How did they clean themselves? What was school like, or love? What happened to sick people? And were there really dungeons? Let's start at the table. Because if you think medieval peasants sat down to turkey legs and tankards of mead, you're in for a surprise. If you're hungry, you might want to wait before eating. Because in the medieval countryside, the dinner table didn't sparkle. It smelled like smoke, sweat, and desperation. No forks, no napkins, no seasoning, no balance. Just survival served in a wooden bowl. For medieval peasants, bread wasn't a side dish. It was the main event. Made from rye, barley, or oats, whatever the harvest gods allowed. Wheat, that was for nobles. The loaves were dense, dark, and gritty, sometimes filled with ground-up beans or even chalk to stretch it out. In famine years, people baked what they called horse bread, a mix of flour, weeds, and tree bark. And the grinding stones used to crush grain? They left bits of rock in the flour. Over time, peasants' teeth were ground down like old millstones themselves. Bread hurt, but it kept you alive. Think of pottage as a medieval crock-pot, except it never stopped cooking. This wasn't soup. It was stew's awkward cousin thick, mushy, and unpredictable. Pottage was made with onions, leeks, cabbages, beans, lentils, and sometimes crushed grains. You threw in whatever the garden gave you or what you could beg or borrow. And meat? A rumor. A fantasy. Unless you had a scrap of old pork fat lying around to add flavor. The same pot sat on the hearth day after day. You'd eat some, then add more water, maybe toss in a turnip. The flavor? Evolving or decaying. Drinking water in the Middle Ages was like playing Russian roulette with dysentery. So instead, everyone drank ale, even toddlers. But this wasn't pub ale. It was called small beer, very low alcohol, just enough to kill bacteria. Women brewed it at home, and it was consumed daily and in large quantities. Ale was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And clean water? Rare. Sometimes people drank from streams contaminated by human waste, dead animals, and everything else. It was a gamble most didn't take twice. Bad harvest? You didn't complain. You adapted, or you died. Famine foods entered the diet when crops failed. Bark, acorns, grass, nettles, even clay or dirt in some extreme cases. People boiled nettles into soup, ground acorns into flour after washing out the toxins, chewed bark to fight hunger pangs. One bad season could mean months of hunger. 2 in a row? Mass death. Meat was restricted by class, legally. Lords hunted game. Peasants didn't. Poaching was common and dangerous. Get caught hunting deer in the king's forest? You could lose a hand. Or your life. So meat became sacred. A fantasy food. Maybe a chicken on Christmas. Maybe a rabbit if no one was watching. Sometimes people would sneak into forests to trap birds or catch fish. Salted pork or dried fish was the most realistic dream, but still rare and expensive. Milk was perishable. Without refrigeration, it turned fast. So most milk was turned into hard cheese or butter. Cheese that could survive for weeks, sometimes months. But if you were poor, you might never see either. Chickens were gold. They meant eggs. But eggs were future chickens. So you didn't eat them unless you really needed to. You had to choose short-term food or long-term survival. Yes, peasants ate their greens, but not like you're imagining. No salads, no citrus, no tomatoes. They wouldn't arrive from the New World for centuries. Instead, diets were root-heavy. Turnips, onions, garlic, radishes, whatever grew underground and could survive storage. Fruit was seasonal and wild apples, plums, berries. If you didn't dry or preserve it, it rotted fast. No sugar, no syrup. Just the natural sweetness of whatever hadn't been eaten by birds first. The medieval calendar was ruled by religion. Over 150 days a year were fast days when meat, eggs, and dairy were forbidden. Lent, 40 days of near starvation. Fridays, no meat. Special holy days, even stricter. So peasants had to adapt. Pottage without lard, bread without butter, maybe salted fish if they could afford it. It wasn't just about survival. It was about obedience. Mealtimes were communal. You didn't eat alone, you ate with family, neighbors, workers. Bread was shared. Ale was passed. If you were part of a manor, you might get food from your lord during holidays, or from the church's alms. Feast days offered moments of joy, roast meat, better bread, maybe a pie. These were rare, but sacred events. Despite poverty, meals had rhythm, ritual, and dignity. You couldn't wash your hands. Not really. Soap, if you had, it was lye-based and abrasive. Most peasants didn't use it daily. You ate with fingers, from shared bowls. Flies, dirt, and animal hair, part of the flavor. Yet somehow, the human gut adapted. For a while. But illnesses like food poisoning, dysentery, worms, and rot were common. Still, many peasants lived into their 40s or 50s, long enough to see children grow, even grandchildren. Their food didn't kill them. Not always. There were no kitchens, just hearths. An open flame in a smoky, single-room home. The fire cooked, heated, and smoked you out. Pots were iron. Spoons were wood. The fridge was a cellar or a cool corner of the house. Cooking was done mostly by women who also brewed ale, gathered herbs, and managed food from field to bowl. Even if your home had 4 walls, the smoke was thick, and the food was never enough. Food wasn't just sustenance. It was control. Lords decided your rations. Weather dictated your future. Religion restricted your choices. And every bite you ate depended on someone else's permission. And if all of that failed, there were always the bark loaves. So yes, peasants ate bread, pottage, and whatever they could find. It was dirty, monotonous, gritty. And yet, it was enough. Until it wasn't. Because in a world without guarantees where every harvest could be your last, food was more than a meal. It was a prayer. And the next time you bite into something fresh, sweet, or warm, remember them. The people who survived on soup without meat, beer without buzz, and bread that bit back. So what happened when you couldn't wash your hands before dinner? What did clean even mean in a world without soap as we know it? The truth about medieval hygiene might surprise you. Let's kill the biggest myth first. Medieval people bathed. Regularly. Passionately. Sometimes communally. Public bathhouses were common across medieval Europe, especially in cities like Paris, London, and Florence. They were called stews, and they were part spa, part social club, part health ritual. People sat in hot wooden tubs, rubbed themselves with scented herbs, sage, thyme, lavender, and listened to music while steam filled the air. Some bathhouses even served food and wine. It wasn't just hygiene, it was culture. Mixed bathing was common in some places. Others separated the sexes or scheduled bathing hours. In Germany and Scandinavia, sauna-like steam baths were popular and considered healthful. The elite bathed at home, dragging a tub near the hearth, with heated water poured in by servants. Even peasants in villages would wash in rivers or communal tubs. The idea that medieval people feared water? It's a Victorian myth. Soap wasn't a luxury. It was essential. Basic soap was made from animal fat and lye harsh, but effective. It removed dirt and grease and sometimes even skin. But it worked. There were different grades of soap. Black soap, rough and cheap. White soap, finer, often imported from Castile or Italy, made with olive oil. Soap makers were a real profession. Markets sold bars and powders. And monasteries often had their own recipes. Cleanliness was tied to godliness. Even if the soap stung, they used it. Want to see medieval cleanliness at its best? Visit a monastery. Monks and nuns were required to maintain routines of washing. Hands before meals. Feet before bed. Full-body baths at regular intervals, especially in Benedictine orders. They also washed the sick, laundered robes and preached the moral value of cleanliness. Some monasteries even had running water, using aqueducts or clever plumbing systems to supply lavatoriums, stone sinks for communal washing. Religious life might have been strict, but it was, surprisingly, pretty clean. Medieval cities weren't designed for hygiene. Imagine this: narrow streets, livestock trotting through alleys, people dumping chamber pots out the window with a quick "Gardaloo." Watch out below. There were no sewers, just open gutters. Waste flowed down the streets, mixing with rainwater, mud, and blood from butcher shops. And yet, there were rules. City governments tried to regulate where animals could be slaughtered, how trash could be disposed, fines for throwing filth into the streets. In Paris, a 14th century law banned leaving waste outside overnight. In London, sanitation fines were real and enforced, depending on who you were. It was a losing battle, but it was a fight. Medieval people didn't have closets full of clothes. Most had 2 or 3 outfits total, but they knew how to keep them wearable. They wore layers, a linen undergarment to soak up sweat and oil, and heavier wool garments over it. The linen could be washed more often, protecting the more expensive outer layers. Laundry was hard labor. Women boiled linens in lye, beat them on stones, dried them in the sun. Soap helped. So did urine used as a detergent for particularly stubborn stains. Yes, really. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. No dentists, no deodorant. So how did they manage? Surprisingly well. People cleaned their teeth with toothpicks made of metal, wood, or bone, cloth rubbings, herbs like mint, sage, or parsley, ash or crushed charcoal rubbed on the gums. Body odor? Managed with herbs sewn into clothes, perfumed pouches, and frequent washing of linen underlayers. Breath fresheners existed too, chewing fennel seeds or cloves. They didn't have Listerine, but they weren't clueless. Cleanliness was spiritual. The church taught that bathing the body reflected care for the soul. Public bathhouses were sometimes attached to hospitals or monasteries. Pilgrims were washed upon arrival at holy sites. Biblical metaphors about washing sins away reinforced the cultural importance of being clean. Dirty clothes could symbolize moral failure. Washing feet was an act of humility. Even saints were known for their hygiene. Saint Hildegard of Bingen wrote about medicinal baths. Saint Francis of Assisi praised cleanliness. In the countryside, nature was both friend and foe. Peasants bathed in streams or tubs outside the home. They gathered herbs for scent and medicinal scrubs. Ashes were used for laundry, but they also lived near animals, pigs, goats, chickens, sometimes under the same roof. Floors were dirt, roofs leaked. Lice and fleas were constant companions. Still, rural life had one advantage. Fewer people meant fewer plagues, less garbage, and better access to clean water than city slums. Why do we think medieval people never bathed? Because of later plagues and changing beliefs. By the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, fears of bathing grew. Doctors claimed that hot water opened the pores, letting in miasma, or bad air. So people stopped bathing out of fear. The result? Early modern Europe, 1500s to 1700s, often became dirtier than the Middle Ages had been. Victorians, obsessed with morality and civilizing the past, exaggerated the filth of the medieval world to make themselves look more advanced. And so the myth was born. So how clean were they really? By modern standards, not very. There was no hand sanitizer, no flush toilets, no idea what germs even were. But by their own standards, cleanliness mattered. It was moral. It was medical. It was social. People tried harder than we give them credit for. They washed. They scrubbed. They perfumed. They boiled water. They sweated over laundry. They cared. So the next time someone says medieval people were disgusting, ask them, compared to what? To us, maybe. But to their world, they were doing their best. And honestly, if you had to live through mud streets, boiling soap made of fat, and linen underwear laundered with urine, wouldn't you deserve a little credit? Now, if you think school is bad today, just wait. Because next, we're heading into a world of wooden benches, cold porridge, beatings, and Latin recitations. Let's talk about how kids learned to read when books were handwritten and pencils didn't exist. Imagine you're 6 years old, but instead of heading to a school with bright posters and lunchboxes, you're walking toward a stone building that smells like wax, ink, and cold. There are no crayons, no alphabet charts, no games, just a hard wooden bench, a slate if you're lucky, and a man in robes who doesn't smile much. And if you fidget, talk, or make a mistake, he has a stick, and he knows how to use it. Welcome to medieval school, where learning was a privilege, a punishment, a path to power, or none of the above, depending entirely on where you were born. Let's start with the big question, who even got educated? If you were a peasant, your school was the field. You learned to plant, plow, and pray. Maybe your parents taught you the Pater Noster, the Lord's Prayer in Latin, even if you didn't understand it. But reading, writing, those were for other people. Education was a privilege, not a right. And even for those who did go to school, class and gender determined what kind of education you received. Boys from noble families were taught Latin, law, theology, and courtly manners. Girls from noble families might learn to read, sew, and manage a household if they weren't married off young. Girls from poor families? No school. Unless they joined a monasteries, cathedrals, and parish churches were the centers of learning. If your village had a priest who could read and teach, you were lucky. Otherwise, you stayed illiterate. For those who did go to school, the parish school was the entry point. Often held in the priest's home or in a church hall, these schools taught the basics: Latin prayers, The alphabet. Simple math using Roman numerals. Choral singing. Everything was memorized. And everything was taught in Latin, even though students didn't speak it. Imagine being 6 years old and having to chant Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto every morning. If you made it through without getting hit, that was a good day. Medieval education wasn't soft. There were no participation trophies. Teachers used corporal punishment as part of daily instruction. A missed answer might earn you a strike on the hand. Whispering? A switch across the back. Daydreaming? You'd be forced to kneel on cold stone or wear a wooden dunce board. The rod wasn't symbolic. It was literal. And while some teachers were kind, many believed that pain trained the soul. Forget backpacks and notebooks. Most students never saw a book. Books were handwritten, expensive, and locked away. A single Bible could take a year to copy and cost more than a peasant made in a decade. So how did kids learn? By memorization, endless repetition. They recited aloud. They sang hymns. They copied letters into wax tablets or scratched them onto slates with chalk. Reading came before writing. Writing came before understanding. And paper? Imported. Rare. Usually reserved for scribes. Medieval education followed the trivium and quadrivium system. Trivium, basic education. Grammar Latin. 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 Logic, how to argue. Rhetoric, how to argue beautifully. Quadrivium, advanced studies. Arithmetic. Geometry. Music. Astronomy. Why Latin? Because all religious, legal, and scholarly texts were in Latin. If you couldn't read it, you couldn't rise. Some schools also taught Bible stories, saints' lives, and basic ethics, like how to respect your betters and fear God. Education in the Middle Ages was almost entirely in the hands of the church. Monks and priests weren't just religious leaders. They were teachers, librarians, scribes. Monasteries became centers of knowledge, preserving ancient Greek and Roman texts. Most schools were attached to monasteries for future monks, cathedrals for future clergy, parishes for the local boys. The church taught not just reading, but morality, order, and obedience. A literate person was more likely to become a cleric, a scribe, or a bureaucrat in a noble court. And so knowledge became a tool of power. Most girls didn't go to school, but there were exceptions. In convents, nuns taught young girls how to read devotional texts, write basic Latin, embroider, sing, and manage household affairs. Noble women like Hildegard of Bingen and Christine de Pizan became writers and scholars. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine were literate, politically savvy, and influential. But overall, medieval education was deeply gendered. Girls were taught to pray, not debate. By the 12th century, something new emerged. Universities. The first ones, Bologna, Oxford, Paris, were chaotic, vibrant, and intense. Students wore robes. Professors lectured without notes. Degrees took years, sometimes decades. Classes were in Latin. Tests were oral, and debates could last for hours. There were no dorms, so students rented rooms, formed gangs, and sometimes fought with locals. University life was both elite and brutal. But for the young men who survived it, it offered pathways to the church, law, medicine, political office. Knowledge was currency, and universities minted it. Not everyone learned in a classroom. Most boys learned a trade: blacksmithing, weaving, carpentry, baking. They became apprentices, living with a master, working all day, and slowly learning the craft. They might also learn basic reading, to read a contract, or keep records In many ways, this hands-on learning was more practical and efficient than Latin grammar and astronomy, and it kept the medieval world running. Education wasn't just about reading scrolls. It was about survival, status, access. A literate peasant might become a priest. A clever student could join a monastery and escape poverty. A noble child who could read might one day rule lands or manipulate those who did. Knowledge wasn't just power. It was a ticket out. So, was medieval school brutal? Yes. Was it rare? Absolutely. Was it powerful? Without a doubt. It shaped minds, forged futures, and maintained the church's grip on power. And it reminds us that education, when it's not taken for granted, can be a revolutionary act. Now, speaking of revolutions, let's talk about what happened when love defied rules, when teenagers whispered behind cloisters, and when romance had to outsmart religion and politics. Because in a world of arranged marriages and social contracts, how did people actually date in the Middle Ages? Forget dinner and a movie. Forget dating apps, texting, or awkward small talk at a coffee shop. In the Middle Ages, love began with a glance across a crowded market, a song drifting from a minstrel's lute, a ribbon passed in secret, a blush quickly hidden, and sometimes love began with a signed agreement between two fathers, long before the bride-to-be had her adult teeth. Welcome to medieval courtship, where love was rare but never impossible. Let's be honest, for nobles, marriage had nothing to do with love. It was about alliances, dowries, land, power. A baron might promise his daughter to another lord's son before she could walk. She was the contract, not the client. Her marriage was a transaction, and her opinion, optional. Noble families drew up contracts with witnesses, signatures, and seals. A girl might be betrothed at age 7, married by 12, and expected to run a household by 14. Romance didn't factor in. Stability did. Peasants had more freedom to choose. If you were a farm boy and she was the miller's daughter, there were ways to make your feelings known. Share food, walk together after Mass, sing to each other during harvest festivals. Courtship often unfolded at the village well, seasonal fairs, local taverns, church events. You didn't have many options. You saw the same faces every day. You knew each other's families, smells, tempers, and secrets. It wasn't swipe right. It was show up every day in the same muddy boots and try to smile. Medieval dating wasn't casual. Courtship had customs, permission from parents, especially the girl's father, gifts to show sincerity, carved spoons, hand-sewn pouches, flowers, or a lock of your own hair. Community approval. Your relationship wasn't private. It was everyone's business. There were expectations. Don't touch unless you're serious. Don't flirt if you're already pledged. Don't shame the family. And there were consequences. If rumors started, a girl's reputation could be permanently ruined. A boy might be forced into marriage or banished. Love was risky. So people got creative. They exchanged tokens, rings, embroidered cloth hearts, tiny pouches of herbs sewn into clothes. And yes, there was magic. People believed in love potions, some made with wine, herbs, and bodily fluids. Charms buried under a lover's doorstep. Binding spells using hair, nail clippings, or personal items. Superstitious? Absolutely. Effective? Debatable. Romantic? In a morbid kind of way. At noble courts, love became performance, Enter the troubadours, wandering poets with lutes and lyrics. They sang of unreachable women, heroic longing, passion without consummation. This was courtly love, a poetic idea that true love was pure, painful, and probably doomed. Noble ladies were idealized. Knights pined from a distance, and everyone swooned over sonnets, even if the lovers ended up marrying someone else. For some, these were just songs. For others, they were instruction manuals on how to desire without destroying reputations. Was there premarital sex? Yes, plenty, but it was risky. If a couple was caught, they might be fined, publicly shamed, pillory anyone, or forced into marriage. Festivals, harvest nights, and May Day celebrations were notorious for their romantic energy. The church tried to suppress it, but the woods were dark and the ale was strong. And if a girl got pregnant, sometimes it led to marriage. Sometimes it led to exile. Love didn't always fit within church doctrine. We have court records of men punished for unnatural acts, women accused of cross-dressing or living together, poems that hint at hidden desire. These stories were rare, not because they didn't happen, but because they were erased. Still, the heart wants what it wants, even under threat of excommunication. Once a couple was matched willingly, or not, it was time for the wedding. The church blessed the union, often in Latin. The couple exchanged vows by handfasting, joining hands. Witnesses were essential. A marriage wasn't valid without them. Sometimes the ceremony was in church. Other times, just at the gate. And afterward, feasting, music, ale, dancing. Marriage was both a sacrament and a social event. And in many villages, it was the biggest party of the year. Love in the Middle Ages was sweet, messy, complicated, often tragic. Many couples barely knew each other before marriage. Some grew to love, others tolerated, and some lived lives of quiet misery. But when love did survive, through war, famine, plague, and politics, it felt almost modern, universal, because beneath the layers of wool and rules and superstition, people were still people, yearning, dreaming, trying. So yes, people in the Middle Ages dated. They flirted. They wrote poetry. They broke rules. Love found cracks in the armor of arranged marriages and social expectations. It whispered under cloaks. It bloomed in gardens. It survived. But what about before love? Before courtship? Before chores? Before responsibilities? What did it mean to be a child in a time of war, superstition, and survival? Because the Middle Ages didn't have cartoons or playdates, but childhood still existed, just not the way we imagine. Let's take a look at what life was like for a medieval child. If you're picturing medieval kids playing hopscotch and flower crowns, slow down. Childhood, at least as we imagine it today, barely existed in the Middle Ages. No toy stores, no school lunches, no safety nets. You were born. You survived if you were lucky. And by the time your baby teeth were out, the world expected something from you. Not innocence, usefulness. In the Middle Ages, you didn't grow up. You were put to work. By age 5 or 6, most kids were already herding animals, fetching water from the stream, tending fires, sweeping hearths, watching younger siblings. If you were noble, you might have a nursemaid or a tutor. But even then, childhood was still a transitional phase, not a protected one. There was no idea of adolescence. You were either too young to help or old enough to. Toys existed, but they weren't Toys R Us. You might have a carved wooden sword, a rag doll with button eyes, a ball made of pig bladder, pebbles for games like knucklebones, a medieval version of jacks. Play wasn't just fun. It was imitation. Girls mimicked spinning wool or stirring stew. Boys pretended to plow fields or ride horses with sticks between their legs. Your playground was the dirt floor, the fields, or the woods behind your house. And your imagination, your most abundant resource. Formal education? Rare, especially for girls. If you were lucky and male, you might go to a parish school to learn Latin prayers, basic reading, and church songs. Most kids, though, learned by doing. Boys learned to sow, harvest, build, and hunt. Girls learned to cook, clean, spin, weave, and nurse. Parents passed down oral stories, prayers, warnings about wolves, witches, and wandering strangers. Knowledge wasn't about self-expression. It was about survival. The world was hard, and so were the odds. Half of all children didn't survive to their 5th birthday. Those who did had seen grief up close. They might lose. A sibling, a mother during childbirth, a playmate to disease or hunger. There was no concept of sheltering children from pain. They lived with it, played beside it, slept next to it, and yet they still laughed, still ran, still played tag in the fields or chased fireflies in summer dusk. Medieval life wasn't all doom and chores. Children looked forward to midsummer festivals with honey cakes and music. Mystery plays religious dramas performed in public squares. Saints' days with dancing, candy, and colored ribbons. Carnivals where mischief was allowed and masks offered escape. For a moment, kids weren't laborers or learners. They were just young, alive, and that counted for something. By age 7 or 8, many boys were sent away. An apprenticeship meant living with a blacksmith, baker, carpenter, or merchant. You learned the trade for 7 to 10 years in exchange for room, board, and discipline. Girls might be placed as servants in wealthier homes, sent to nunneries to be trained for religious life, promised in marriage contracts they didn't understand. This was the end of childhood, as most knew it. Not because they matured, but because the world expected them to. Not every child followed the rules. Some ran away, becoming thieves, vagrants, or traveling performers. Some resisted apprenticeships. Some disappeared into cities. Others into the forest. Most children, forgotten by history. Their names never written. Their faces never painted. But you'll find traces of them in lullabies, in saints' legends, in anonymous scribbles in the margins of old books. Despite the harshness, there was love. Real, aching parental love. Parents grieved their lost children. They named new babies after dead ones. They offered bread to saints. They wept quietly behind doors, away from the other children. A mother might sew her child a charm to wear around their neck. A father might carve a toy horse in the middle of winter, just to see a smile. Because even in a brutal world, tenderness survived. So what was childhood in the Middle Ages? It was short, hard, sometimes joyful, often forgotten. But it was real. And beneath all the work, the loss, and the rules, children were loved. Which raises the next question. What did medieval people think about love itself? Not just courtship, not flirtation, but the deep kind. The kind that made people write poems, or die in wars, or build chapels, or wait decades for a single letter. Because to understand the medieval world, you don't just need to know how they lived. You need to know what they believed about the one thing that still makes the world go round. Let's talk about medieval love songs, saints, and everything in between. Love in the Middle Ages wasn't just a feeling. It was a code, a trial, a wound you wore proudly. It could send knights to war, women to convents, and poets to madness. Sometimes it saved people. Sometimes it destroyed them. And sometimes it did both. Let's begin where love became theater, the noble courts. This was the age of courtly love, a ritualized, poetic obsession that turned longing into a lifestyle. It wasn't about marriage. It was about yearning for someone you couldn't have, for a love that tested your virtue, for a woman so noble, so untouchable, that just gazing upon her became a spiritual act. Knights would dedicate duels to their lady's honor. Troubadours roamed from castle to castle, singing of eyes like stars, and hearts torn asunder. If your heart wasn't in pain, then you weren't in love. You see it everywhere. In the lyrics of the Carmina Burana, in the whispered poems of Chrétien de Troyes, in the candlelit sighs of lovers who believed suffering made love purer. This wasn't about fulfillment. This was about devotion without reward. A knight would serve a lady like a priest served God, faithfully, hopelessly, eternally. Think of it as medieval emotional masochism, celebrated in ballads. Outside, the dream of courtly love was the reality of marriage. It was a business deal. Dowries were negotiated, land exchanged, bloodlines fortified. But that didn't mean affection was absent. We have surviving letters, husbands writing to wives from battlefields, calling them by nicknames, praying for their health. People loved within marriage, even if it began with strategy. And sometimes they loved outside of it too. To the church, love was holy, but also dangerous. You were encouraged to love God, Christ, the Virgin Mary. But physical desire? That was the devil's whisper. Priests preached that lust led to ruin. Passion needed restraint. Marriage was the only acceptable outlet, and even then, only for procreation. And yet, monks wrote poetry to Christ that sounded like romance. Nuns wrote of visions where Jesus held them, kissed them, wept with them. It was love, but sacred, terrifying, uncontainable, a fever of the soul. Despite sermons, people fell into each other's arms anyway. We know from church court records of lovers caught in the act, confessions of priests, punishments for extramarital affairs. There were rules, but also a lot of breaking. Desire didn't ask permission. It found alleyways, forests, feast day chaos, and sometimes it ended in scandal. Yes, it existed, quietly. We find hints in trial records, in poems with ambiguous pronouns, in letters that blur the line between platonic and romantic. The church condemned it. Society punished it. But still, love persisted. Some lovers disguised themselves. Others confessed. A few were burned. But many were simply erased until we started looking closer. Some of the most profound medieval love stories begin at the grave. We find tombs built side by side, widows visiting shrines for decades, songs written for lovers lost to plague or war. Love in the Middle Ages was fleeting. Life was uncertain, which made the act of loving, truly loving, both risky and sacred. You didn't take it for granted. You held it like a flame, even when it burned. So, what did medieval people think of love? That it could wound, that it could redeem, that it could elevate you closer to God or drag you into sin. Love was in the chapel, the battlefield, the bakery, the back alley. It was whispered in monasteries, shouted in ballads, scribbled into margins. It wasn't always safe. It wasn't always kind, but it was everywhere. Still, not all medieval stories end in poetry. Some end underground, in silence, in places where no light enters and no ballads are sung. Because not every punishment in the Middle Ages ended with a fine. Some ended in a dungeon. So let's go there next. Let's ask the question that still chills our bones. Were there really dungeons? You've seen the tropes. A prisoner chained to the wall, rats in the corner, a slow drip of water echoing in the dark. A flickering torch reveals a rusted gate, a skeleton in rags, a name scratched into stone. But was that really the medieval dungeon? Yes and no. Let's start with the name. The word dungeon comes from the French donjon, which actually meant the main tower of a castle. Not a prison, not a torture chamber. A fortress, the stronghold, the last safe room in a siege. Over time, the term was reimagined in English, twisted by legend, fear, and storytelling. By the 14th century, dungeon came to mean an underground prison, dark, airless, and brutal. And in some places, it absolutely was. Here's something surprising. Most medieval punishments didn't involve jail at all. Why? Because imprisonment was expensive and inefficient. The medieval justice system preferred speed and spectacle. Fines for theft, pillories and stocks for dishonor, public floggings, nose cutting or branding, executions for the worst offenders. Prisons, when they existed, were mainly holding cells, a temporary stop before your trial, or a pit stop before execution. Some castles had dedicated prison cells, beneath spiral staircases, behind hidden trapdoors, or deep in the earth, where no light reached. There were no toilets, just holes in the ground, if that. No beds, just damp stone. No clocks. No visitors. And sometimes, no end in sight. One notorious design was the oubliette, a vertical shaft with a trapdoor above. The prisoner was dropped in. Food might be lowered by rope. Waste wasn't. There was no door, no way out. You weren't just forgotten. You were meant to be forgotten. We imagine damp basements, but some prison chambers were high in towers where isolation was more psychological, built into city gates so every traveler heard your cries, hidden beneath churches or monasteries used by inquisitors, not lords. Others weren't rooms at all. Some were iron cages suspended in public, called gibbets. Criminals, dead or alive, were displayed to rot in plain sight. Their crime wasn't just punished, it was paraded. Dungeons weren't just for the poor. Nobles were sometimes locked away for political reasons, betrayal, hostage negotiations, unpaid ransoms. Some brought servants with them. Others were allowed books, furniture, even wine. But it was still captivity. Famous case? King Richard the Lionheart, held in a distant Austrian castle while his kingdom paid the largest ransom in medieval history. Over 30 tons of silver. Torture existed, but it wasn't every day. It was used selectively to extract confessions during inquisitions against political enemies. Yes, there were tools. The rack, thumbscrews, the strappato, where victims were hoisted, then dropped to dislocate shoulders. The infamous Iron Maiden? Probably a myth, at least in the Middle Ages. Its legend grew in later centuries. More often, the cruelty was psychological. Starvation, darkness, solitude, sleep deprivation. Torture wasn't just a tool. It was a performance for power, not just truth. Being imprisoned meant facing more than walls. You could die from infection, be forgotten by family, get replaced in court or in love, or write poetry from the shadows. Some prisoners became legends, others disappeared, but all of them, noble or not, were reminders of the thin line between freedom and fate. So yes, dungeons were real. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but when they existed, they were brutal. A dark corner of medieval justice, built not just to hold bodies, but to break spirits. Still, the dungeon wasn't always the scariest place in the Middle Ages. Sometimes, the real terror wore a white apron, carried a blade, and came with good intentions. Because in the medieval world, if you got sick or wounded, you didn't go to a doctor. You went to the barber, and not for a haircut. Welcome to medieval medicine, where the cure was often worse than the disease. Imagine this. You're lying on a splintered wooden table. No anesthesia, no antiseptic, just a leather strap between your teeth, and a man with a rusty knife who thinks he knows what he's doing. He probably doesn't. But you're already dying, so you let him try. Welcome to medieval surgery, where survival was a miracle and pain was a guarantee. Let's talk about the barbers. Yes, the same ones who trimmed beards and cut hair. They were also the guys who amputated limbs, drained abscesses, and removed arrows from battlefield wounds. You know that red and white pole outside barbershops today? Red stood for blood, white for bandages. The pole itself? It was a replica of what patients held while being bled. Barber surgeons weren't scholars. They were practical butchers, respected for their bravery, feared for their work. There was no luxury of time. When a leg had to come off, the surgeon cut fast and deep. There were no gloves, no masks, no sterile tables. Instruments were often reused without cleaning. Cloth bandages were reused. Pus wasn't feared, it was welcomed, thought to indicate the body was fighting back. No understanding of germs, just bad humors. If you survived infection, it was luck or divine will. The surgery itself might last minutes. The recovery? Weeks of fever, rot, and hoping your body didn't betray you. Some of these tools would make a horror film blush. Bone saws iron, serrated and brutal. Scalpels crude but sharp. Cautery irons heated until red hot, then pressed into wounds to stop bleeding. Trepanation drills used to bore holes into skulls. Yes, on living people. Hooks, needles, forceps, each with a story soaked in pain. Trepanation, incredibly, sometimes worked, enough that people kept drilling, believing it could release pressure, spirits, or madness. And they weren't always wrong. Let's give credit where it's due. Medieval medicine wasn't all superstition. Surgeons translated and studied Greek, Roman, and Arabic texts. From Galen to Avicenna, knowledge trickled in. Arab medical works introduced better surgical methods, herbal remedies, and opiates. Some surgeons even used sponges soaked in opium and mandrake as primitive anesthetics. And yes, there were cesarean sections, though most were fatal for the mother. Still, there were survivors, enough to earn a chapter in history. They could reset bones, stitch wounds, and perform bladder stone extractions with shocking skill. Hospitals existed, but not like today. They were run by monasteries, religious orders, charitable guilds. There were no doctors in white coats, just monks and nuns tending to the sick with broth, prayer, clean linen, gentle hands. These weren't places of cure. They were places of care. And sometimes that made all the difference. You went to a hospital not to be healed, but to be comforted, to die with dignity, or, in rare cases, to walk out alive. The church had an uneasy relationship with surgery. Cutting open the body was often frowned upon. Anatomy was sacred. Dissection was rare, and sometimes forbidden. Yet, paradoxically, healing the sick was considered a holy act. So while barbers wielded blades, monks copied medical texts. Nuns brewed herbal remedies. Priests offered last rites just in case. Pain wasn't just a side effect. It was part of the process. A test of faith. A penance. So how dangerous was medieval surgery? Deadly. Bloody. Primitive. But not without hope. It was the last resort when every prayer had failed. When fever burned too hot. When bone snapped too clean. When death stood in the doorway, tapping its foot. And sometimes, just sometimes, they got it right. But not everyone had equal access to medicine. And not every patient had a voice. Because in the medieval world, if you were a woman, your pain wasn't just physical. It was social, legal, spiritual. So what did medieval women do all day? What rights did they have? What power did they hold? And what secrets did they carry that never made it into the history books? Let's walk a day in her shoes. Next. What did a medieval woman do all day? That depends. Was she barefoot in the fields or wrapped in silk behind castle walls? Was she delivering a baby? Brewing ale? Illuminating manuscripts by candlelight? Was she managing a market stall? Or managing a kingdom? Because in the Middle Ages, a woman's role was never one thing. It was hundreds, every hour, every day, often invisible, never simple. Let's start where most women lived, the village. You wake before the rooster crows. There's no clock. You rise with the cold. Your hands are cracked from winter. Your back aches before the day begins. Your husband is already tending livestock. You tend everything else. Stoke the hearth. Fetch water from the well. Milk the goat. Grind grain. Bake coarse bread. Feed the children. Tend the garden. Tend the sick. Tend yourself last, if ever. Your days are a blur of labor, repetition, and small vital victories. And when your husband dies, you don't stop. You inherit his work, if not his name. Medieval records show widows running farms, negotiating sales, paying taxes. The world didn't wait for morning. Women worked, constantly. Some helped in the fields. Some ran alehouses. Some made cheese or spun wool to sell at market. In towns, women joined guilds, textiles, brewing, midwifery, became sellers, scribes, healers, and apothecaries. They passed on knowledge orally through repetition, not books. A daughter learned from her mother how to soothe a fever with chamomile, bind a wound with ash and honey, deliver a baby with hands steady and strong. And while they couldn't attend universities, women often knew more about real healing than men with titles. Legally, marriage changed everything. Once wed, you lost your legal identity. You became part of your husband. You couldn't own property unless widowed or noble. You needed permission to marry, inherit, or sue. Your husband controlled your fate, even your body. But marriage also anchored power. A clever wife could influence household decisions, forge alliances, raise future heirs, and manage estates behind the scenes. Marriage wasn't always about love, but affection grew. Children bonded, and many women found meaning in their families despite their constraints. Childbirth was sacred and terrifying. There were no hospitals, no anesthesia, No guarantees. Women died. Babies died. But midwives did everything they could, relying on herbs, intuition, and years of whispered wisdom. A woman might give birth to 8 or 10 children and lose half. Yet she sang lullabies anyway, lit candles for protection, prayed through labor, held life in her arms, knowing how fragile it was. Some women chose a different path, the cloistered life. The convent offered literacy, access to books, safety from marriage and childbirth, spiritual agency. Abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen wrote music, theology, philosophy. They ran convents like businesses. They preached when women were banned from preaching. They healed. They taught. They documented. The veil didn't always mean submission. Sometimes it meant freedom. Medieval women were saints like Catherine of Siena, scholars like Christine de Pizan, scapegoats accused of witchcraft for knowing too much. A woman with herbs? Suspect. A woman with knowledge? Dangerous. A woman who challenged the church? Heretical. But women still carved their names into the story, sometimes in ink, sometimes in fire. Not all women lived quietly. Eleanor of Aquitaine ruled 2 kingdoms. Isabella of Castile reshaped an empire. Joan of Arc led armies, heard voices, and was burned for her bravery. These weren't exceptions. They were the tip of an unseen army. Women who negotiated, advised, and ruled from behind veils and thrones. So what did a medieval woman do all day? She carried. She bled. She cooked. She endured. She raised lives. She buried them. She prayed, loved, defied, and dreamed. You won't always find her name in a chronicle, but you'll find her fingerprints on the bread, on the herbs, on the needlework, on the pages of illuminated manuscripts, on the bones of nations. And through her story, we glimpse a fuller picture of the world she helped build. But before we end our journey through medieval life, let's take one last look at that world as a whole. Not just its darkness, but its rhythm, its color, its joy. Let's talk about the festivals, the music, the rituals, and the stories that gave medieval life its soul. Because beneath all the mud, and fear, and struggle, life still danced. Let's step back. Zoom out from the muddy fields, the monastic scriptoriums, the smoky kitchens, and the frozen tower rooms. What was the rhythm of life in the Middle Ages? What gave it shape, pulse, color? The answer? Time. But not digital time. Not clocks or calendars as we know them. Natural time. Sacred time. Seasonal time. 1. The medieval clock. Roosters, bells, and sunlight. There were no alarms. You rose with the lightor, the sound of animals. You moved with the cycle of the sun and the ring of the church bell. Time wasn't counted in minutes. It was marked in when dew dried from the grass, when shadows stretched across your doorstep, when the Angelus rang for prayer, when smoke curled from chimneys at dusk. The body didn't fight the clock. It followed the land. 2. Clothing a language of wool and status. Everyone wore layers. Linen underneath to soak up sweat. Wool on top for warmth. Belts to cinch. Cloaks for rain. Hoods for modesty or mystery. For peasants, muted browns, grays, and undyed wool. For nobles, rich dyes, fur trims, ornate embroidery, if they could afford it and if the sumptuary laws allowed it. Everything was scratchy. Everything was repaired. Fashion changed not by the season, but by the century. Even what you wore told the world who you were. 3. Homes where the hearth was the heart. The average peasant home? One room, dirt floor, a hearth in the center, no chimney, just smoke drifting upward. Thatched roof, often alive with insects. Chickens might sleep inside with the family. A wealthier home? Maybe 2 stories. Maybe a chimney. Maybe glass in the windows. A rare, costly luxury. Beds were straw-stuffed sacks. Light came from rushlights or tallow candles. The air smelled of wood smoke, sweat, soil, and cooked onions. But it was home. Sturdy, shared, sacred. 4. Rituals, sacred time, daily life. Every day was patterned by ritual. Morning prayers. Bread for breakfast. Chores divided and repeated. Work measured by bells, sun, and hunger. Sunday was for rest. Your best tunic. A walk to church. A sermon that might be the only public speech you'd hear all week. And life's big moments, all ritualized. Baptisms, weddings, death processions, candlelit vigils, masses sung in echoing stone halls. Even grief had structure. Even joy had rules. 5. Festivals, when the world turned upside down. When it was time to celebrate, medieval life exploded with color. Feast days for saints. Harvest festivals after the final sheaf was cut. Carnivals before Lent, full of masks and mischief. May Day, with flower crowns and fertility rites no one dared name. Midsummer, with bonfires blazing against the longest night. People danced. They drank ale. They watched jugglers, musicians, and mystery plays that told sacred stories in the language of the crowd. Even peasants dirt under their nails, aches in their backs dressed up. These weren't just parties. They were the spiritual release valves of a hard, structured world. 6. The cosmos above, the music below. People looked up at the stars and saw signs, not science. Horoscopes guided planting and marriage. Eclipses foretold danger. The moon shaped dreams and madness. And everywhere there was music. Flutes, lutes, hurdy-gurdies, church choirs that shook stone with harmony, field songs, work chants, cradle songs for sleepless babies, love ballads for hopeless hearts. Music wasn't entertainment. It was life's companion, the thread beneath the toil. Final reflection, where we come from. This was medieval life. Messy, repetitive, sacred, loud, gritty, colorful, quiet, slow, beautiful. It wasn't just pain and piety. It wasn't just blood and darkness. It was human. People loved. People sang. People made bread and raised children and told stories by firelight. Yes, the world was smaller, harder, but it pulsed with meaning. And if you look closely, really closely, you'll see that we haven't drifted so far. Because even now, we crave rhythm. We seek ritual. We need stories. And this strange, muddy, misunderstood world, it's where we come from. Close your eyes in the Middle Ages, and your dreams weren't just dreams. They were messages from God, from demons, from the world beyond. A restless night wasn't about stress or too much bread. It was about sin, about divine warning, a vision of fire, lust, a fall from a tower, pride, snakes slithering toward you, deceit, a baby crying in the mist. Maybe death was near. In a world lit by candles and shadowed by fear, dreams weren't forgotten. They were interpreted, cataloged, feared. Medieval people believed dreams could reveal hidden sins, predict the future, unmask enemies, or offer glimpses of heaven or hell. The church had rules about dreams. Some were divinely inspired visions of saints or Christ. Others were traps, demonic illusions meant to seduce or terrify. Clergy consulted dream manuals. Monks kept journals of nighttime visions. Lay people visited traveling dream interpreters, or asked their local priest what it meant. When they saw a wolf with a bleeding mouth, sometimes dreams were seen as sacred prophecy, other times as dangerous temptation. Dreams weren't the only things that carried meaning. Everyday life was thick with signs. A black cat crossing your path, a bird tapping at the window, a candle flickering oddly, a birthmark in the wrong place. These weren't quirks. They were omens. People whispered prayers when passing a graveyard, crossing a bridge at night, hearing a sudden scream in the distance. They hung herbs above doorways, sage for wisdom, rue for protection, garlic to ward off evil. They drew crosses on loaves of bread before baking. They refused to sweep at night for fear of brushing away good spirits. Even the smallest acts had weight. Spill salt? Throw some over your shoulder, or risk bad luck. Drop a knife? A visitor is coming. Sneezing? Say, God bless you quickly, or your soul might escape. Twins? A blessing, or a sign of witchcraft. Left-handed child? Distrust and discipline. Superstition wasn't silliness. It was a way to exert control in a world that felt uncontrollable. Nature was unpredictable. Disease was sudden. Famine had no mercy. So people looked for patterns, reasons, even if those reasons came from the stars, from dreams, from shadows in the corner of the room. The church tried to control the narrative. Dreams were okay if approved. Herbs were fine if blessed. Superstition was tolerated until it wasn't. Folk beliefs lived in the gray space. Healers used charms and chants. Mothers tied red strings around babies' wrists to ward off evil spirits. Communities believed in fairies, spirits, forest beings, and the evil eye. And when the church lost patience, these harmless acts could suddenly become heresy. Or worse, because sometimes a dream wasn't just a dream. Sometimes a superstition wasn't just a habit. Sometimes those signs pointed to someone. A woman who lived alone, a girl who healed too well, an old widow with too many cats, a midwife whose herbs worked a little too effectively. And when fear ran high and crops ran low, it didn't take much to tip the scales. Next, we enter the firelit world of medieval witchcraft, where suspicion had teeth, where justice wore a hood, and where a whisper could turn into a pyre. Not every wise woman was welcomed. Sometimes knowledge was dangerous, especially if you were poor, unmarried, or didn't know when to stay quiet. That's where the word began to twist. That's where witch came in. Forget the Hollywood broomstick. In the Middle Ages, a witch was rarely someone cackling over a cauldron. She might be a healer with jars of dried herbs, a midwife who knew how to ease labor pains, a widow with no man to defend her, a woman who lived alone and didn't apologize for it. She might cure your fever with willow bark, an early form of aspirin, or she might glare at your cow, and it dies the next morning. And just like that, healer becomes threat. Witch hunts didn't explode until later, especially during the Renaissance and early modern period. But the seeds were already there in the Middle Ages. Early Christian doctrine warned of false prophets, women who consorted with demons, heretical knowledge passed down outside the church. By the 13th and 14th centuries, fear simmered. church leaders issued condemnations of folk practices. Some local bishops held inquisitions. A few witches were tried and executed. Not many, but enough to sow fear. Most accusations were vague: causing illness, withering crops, cursing a neighbor, or simply being different. Many accused witches were women who helped others. Midwives who understood childbirth better than most men. Apothecaries who blended herbs with uncanny accuracy. Cunning women who used charms, prayers, and poultices to treat. Fevers, wounds, infertility, heartache. They didn't see themselves as witches. They saw themselves as useful. Their knowledge came not from spell books, but from mothers and grandmothers before them. And yet, the more effective they were, the more dangerous they seemed. Villagers told stories of women who spoke to animals, of shadowy figures glimpsed in the woods, of sudden illness that followed a scorned handshake. Superstition filled the gaps in science, and fear filled the gaps in power. Sometimes a bad harvest needed a scapegoat. Sometimes grief needed a villain. Sometimes people just wanted someone to blame, and so they blamed her. Some were exiled. Some were stoned. Some were burned. Many were just watched, forever seen as suspicious, even if they never faced trial. The deeper question: why were women the ones so often accused? Because they were visible, vulnerable, outside male control, trusted by other women in ways the church couldn't always monitor. And power, especially unofficial power, was threatening. A man could hold power in public, but a woman who held influence in private, in the home, in the birthing chamber, that was unsettling. So when fear rose, knowledge turned into suspicion, authority turned into heresy, healing turned into witchcraft. But not all power came from herbs and whispers. Some came from land, from coin, from titles etched in gold and sealed with wax. Because while women were being accused of sorcery for knowing too much, men were rising through the church, the courts, and the merchant guilds for knowing how to control money. And in the medieval world, money didn't just talk, it ruled. So who got rich? Who stayed poor? And how did a world that believed in angels and demons also give rise to bankers, taxes, and fortunes? Let's follow the silver. Because to understand how medieval society really worked, you have to follow the money. Most people in the Middle Ages never saw a single gold coin. Not one. They didn't pay with money. They paid with eggs, cheese, wool, or work. A loaf of bread here, a day of labor there. But make no mistake, wealth existed. It was just concentrated, high above them, out of reach. At the bottom were peasants and serfs, not enslaved, but not free. They worked the land, but didn't own it. And every harvest, a chunk was owed to the local lord, who owed a portion to a higher lord, who owed a tax to the king. It was a chain of obligation, a pyramid built not on stone, but on bread, barley, and back-breaking labor. A peasant might go months without touching a single coin. Their wealth was measured in goats that didn't die this winter, clothing that still fit, children who made it past age 5. While rural life ran on barter, the towns began to pulse with trade. Markets buzzed. Craftsmen organized into guilds, the precursors to unions. Butchers, bakers, tanners, weavers. These weren't just jobs. They were identities. A guild protected your skill, regulated prices, trained apprentices, and if you did well, lifted your status. Merchants grew powerful. They imported silk from Byzantium, spices from the Levant, salt and iron from distant mines. And with that, wealth came independence. Some towns bought charters from kings, gaining rights that even nobles didn't have. And for the first time, money started to challenge blood. In Italy, families like the Medici were rising. They didn't fight wars. They funded them. They issued loans, managed accounts, and quietly, they reshaped Europe. Coins were minted with kings' faces, but it was the merchant bankers who kept them in circulation. Even in England and France, new banking networks began to sprout, built on trust, credit, and long-distance risk. Wealth was no longer just land and cattle. It became math. It became paper. It became power. The church owned more land than any noble, more wealth than any merchant, more loyalty than any crown. Tithes were mandatory. 10% of your income, even if you barely had enough to eat. Cathedrals rose from the earth, like stone prayers, paid for by peasants' bread and wool. Monasteries controlled entire villages. Some monks lived in humble silence. Others, not so much. They dined well, wore finer robes, collected relics and rents. Salvation, it seemed, could be brokered. Wealth didn't just buy land. It bought safety, freedom, immunity. If you were poor, you might be punished for theft with a whipping, tried without representation, jailed for a debt that wasn't yours. If you were rich, you paid a fine. You hired a scribe. You left town. Laws weren't blind. They squinted at coin purses. Still, even the poorest took pride in labor. The blacksmith whose hammer sang through the village, the weaver whose fingers danced faster than thought, the baker who rose with the darkness to feed others with warmth. Work was sacred. It wasn't just survival. It was honor. People etched their initials into tools, sang while spinning wool, told stories by firelight. After the last nail was hammered, even in poverty, there was dignity. So, yes, medieval wealth was uneven. It was brutal. It was inherited. It was bought with taxes from people who'd never tasted the wine it funded. But amid that inequality, there was also resilience. People endured, not just out of necessity, but out of pride, out of faith, out of love. Because while the gold stayed in castles, the heart of the Middle Ages beat in the hands of those who tilled, baked, brewed, carved, stitched, and believed. And in those hands, calloused, tired, unrecognized, you find the real soul of the medieval world. So now we've walked their roads. We've woken up on straw beds and tasted bitter pottage. We've felt the weight of chores, the sting of punishment, the thrill of secret love, and the dread of walking into a healer's hut with a fever you might not walk out from. We've seen how they lived, not in fantasy, not in black and white, but in full color. Because the Middle Ages weren't some static, backward time trapped in ignorance. They were alive, complex, messy, and deeply human. This was a world where people sang while they worked, cried when their children died, believed in angels and burned witches, painted cathedrals that touched the clouds, and sewed socks that barely reached their ankles. They were terrified of what they didn't understand, and still tried to understand it anyway. They were poor, but they created beauty. They were tired, but they told stories. They were afraid, but they loved fiercely. They weren't all kings or knights. Most were just people, ordinary, nameless people trying to survive the next harvest, raise their children, avoid sickness, stay warm through winter. And isn't that what we all do? Strip away the technology, the language, the clothes hand, What's left is the same raw material: hope, fear, love, loss, effort, imagination. We think of history as something behind us, finished, distant. But the truth is, it lives in us, in the way we raise families, in the rhythms of our days, in the architecture of our cities, in our fears, our faiths, and our jokes. So no, the Middle Ages weren't just darkness and disease. They were candlelight and long winters, songs echoing through stone, the first sparks of questions that still burn today. They were us just in another time. And maybe, if you listen closely, the bells still ring.